But first tonight, one figure Peter Dutton never thought he'd have to distance himself from during this election campaign was the United States president. Yet the focus group research is clear. Trump is mostly disliked by Australians, and Albanese has been successful in linking Dutton with Donald Trump. Yet, while he is on the nose in Australia, polls show Trump's popularity is at a record high in the United States. But just like the Tampa affair cast a shadow over the 2001 election, the Trump factor is looming large as a dominant influence this campaign. And the mood here has turned against Trump, with polling showing that 60% of Australians think his election win has been bad for Australia. This jumped from the 40% who said the same thing just in November. And even shockingly, more people think the United States is a greater threat to Australia than Russia. This even as Beijing comes out in support of Albanese. Chinese state media today accused Dutton of beating the drums of war against China, and then they praised Albanese for speaking the truth. This is the most obvious sign that the Albanese government has been cozying up to China in submission to the communist dictatorship. Yet for Albanese, China is an issue he's ignoring. He seems unconcerned about the spy ships circumnavigating our southern coast. Instead, he's capitalising on their anti-Trump sentiment, continually comparing Dutton to the president. And he's compared Elon Musk's Doge cuts with Dutton's public service cuts. Never mind that Dutton is actually trying to address the debt blowout, which is on track to hit $1 trillion next year. Well, here are Albanese's senior ministers linking Dutton to Trump.
Peter Dutton is going to back Trump over Australia.
This is Doji Dutton taking his cues, his instructions and his policies straight from the US in a way that will make Australians worse off.
We don't have to adopt all of America's policies.
Yep, well, the Australian's foreign editor Greg Sheridan rightly points out that no one seriously thinks Dutton is an Australian version of Trump. That prospect, he says, is absurd. But he notes that 6 weeks ago, the Trump effect looked like a plus for Peter Dutton. Now it's a small minus and a corresponding plus for Albanese. And Sheridan writes that Trump may become so unpopular in Australia that publicly opposing him becomes politically advantageous. He says that would be very dangerous for Australia. Yet it seems we're already in that place because Dutton had no option but to counter Albanese's insinuation that he's Trump-light. The opposition leader came out strongly today, saying he was prepared to take on the American president.
Ultimately, what people want is a Prime Minister who can stand up for our country. And what they've seen in Anthony Albanese is somebody who doesn't have the strength or the backbone or the will to stand up for our country's interests. He can't stand up to China at the moment.
So you'd have a fight with Donald Trump?
If I needed to have a fight with Donald Trump or any other world leader to advance our nation's interests, I'd do it in a heartbeat.
And Dutton has also been asking voters to consider who is a stronger figure to protect Australia's interests abroad, himself or Albanese. Now, former Prime Minister John Howard said this comparison between Dutton and Trump is nonsense. Here he was speaking earlier with Chris Kenny.
Likewise here, Donald Trump looms large over the election campaign, doesn't he? Labor is trying to smear Peter Dutton as some sort of Trumpian figure. Is that realistic? Is it a political threat?
The Labor Party will try any dodge, but it's not realistic. OK, Trump is centre-right, so to speak, although in my view he's not a real conservative. I mean, there are a lot of conservative values that I hold to that he apparently doesn't. I mean, he attacks his own security services. I don't think that makes any sense. On the other hand, things he's said about gender identity and university and so forth, I agree with. Most sensible Australians do, but that's, as it were, the low-hanging fruit. That's the easy part of it. The harder part is what you do to your allies, and to undermine Canada is just, I find it inexplicable.
Well, there's no escaping that aside from Albanese and Dutton, Trump is the most dominant figure this election, and he's turned into a negative for Dutton. Now, I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is the sentiment that's showing up in focus group research. Initially, Trump's refusal to take Albanese's phone call was highly embarrassing for the Prime Minister. But now Trump is seen by Australians as too volatile, too extreme, too chaotic and too untrustworthy an ally. And this shift in sentiment from Australians was when Trump mistreated Ukrainian President Zelensky in the White House. That was the pivotal moment. And now, with the Liberation Day tariff set to be imposed on Australia, this will continue the sentiment towards the president. Now, these attitudes were clear from the voters that Laura J spoke to in the crucial Central Coast seat of Robertson earlier today.
Definitely like Albanese. There's no way I could go for Dutton because he's a Trump man. I don't like nuclear and, he wants to sack all the public servants and, there's a lot of things I don't like.
I just don't like Donald Trump. Peter Dutton, who's a very Donald Trump-esque person. I don't want to cut public services and be very anti-immigration.
It's interesting because the Trump factor initially meant that left-wing governments around the world were on notice. Trump's victory seemed to signal the end of woke ideology. But now the concern about his reliability and conduct has seen this flip, so that it's conservative politicians who are suffering from Trump damage. But the obsession with Trump is ultimately a distraction from the central issues in our country: cost of living, national security, and Albanese's own incompetence. Now, Dutton has spoken often during this campaign and before about Howard's influence on him, how Howard is the sort of leader that he aspires to be. And the former Prime Minister stresses Albanese's incompetence.
The description I would make of the Prime Minister is that he's out of his depth. Now, as a Liberal leader, I disagreed with the Labor leaders a lot. I disagreed with Bob Hawke a lot. But I never thought Hawke was out of his depth. I just thought he was wrong. I disagreed even more with Paul Keating, who I thought was inferior to Hawke as a Prime Minister. But you could never say he was out of his depth. Whereas I don't think Anthony Albanese quite knows what's happening around him.
Wow, well, it's a brutal assessment, but it's one that not even Albanese's own colleagues would argue with, because he is a lightweight leader. His intellect and grasp of subject matter is skin deep. It's why, as John Howard says, despite the fact that Australians usually give first-term governments another go, he believes Dutton has a chance at winning.
History is still against it, but we have got a Prime Minister who's clearly out of his depth, and we have a situation where in less than 3 years the economic situation has deteriorated.